Okay, never mind. We start. Yeah, we start anyway. Yeah, I'm absolutely delighted to have Kubra here. Now, I forgot to ask you how to pronounce your surname.
It's zermis, but Kübra is totally fine as well.
Yeah, but it's good to hear the full name, to remember it when we hear it. Yeah, because think you have something important to say. She wrote her PhD on a topic that she's going to introduce to us here. Is that correct? And unfortunately, she didn't bring the book herself, but she promised that she'll send me a screenshot or so that I can pass it on to everybody. You can look at it. I know that Jenny Ferrer, for instance, from Galway, Atlantic Oil College is very interested in it. Yeah, she has a similar research focus, and perhaps we can get in contact or put you in contact. So, yeah, no, I'm very pleased to have it. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. But before we start, there are two lovely announcements here. The first concerns the Sorbian studies because we are now granted a junior professor for Sorbian literature. We haven't had a professor for Sorbian literature for the last 30 years. Yeah. Now, there is a bit of an attempt to revive this, to get back into place. It's a junior professor. It was announced here today. Please make it known to everybody. I'll send a list to our secretary here to announce that to others as well, because we fear a bit that we might not be able to fill it. Yeah. And then the university will not grant us another. Yeah. So announce that widely. There's a typo in German. Don't worry. The application time is according to how it should be. It's announced in German, in Sorbian, and should have been announced in English as well, is it not? Well, we don't know. Anyway, it isn't. So then it isn't. Yeah. Good. Now, the second lovely announcement I have to make is that our secretary is now also an MA holder. Yeah. So he finished his MA on a lovely piece here. It is basically discussing the Sorbian language in the 19th century, and he produced a lovely little piece of lovely book. Yeah, I showed that before. We were allowed, or the head of department said then we should order that for the university. I can just recommend that to all of you. Yeah, there's easy access. So, and we are delighted and hope to have him back into teaching soon. But first, we have here our guest, and I'm so delighted to have her here. She traveled just to give that presentation. Yeah, all the hassle of public transport. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me in the first place. I'm very delighted to talk to you. I'll be probably talking about the Irish language from a different perspective than you usually discuss in the setting, given that my background is also literary and cultural studies. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Potsdam now, and previously I had been at the Freie University, which is basically where this project was also completed. What I will be speaking about today is actually the role of the Irish language in writing very specifically the poetry on a massacre that happened in the context of the Northern Irish conflict. And what I will be basically doing in this small brief talk is I will basically talk a little bit about the massacre itself, just so we're on the same page. Some of you will have probably heard of it. Then I will be elaborating on why it has been written about in the first place. That's basically where my research kind of comes in. And then I will zoom into two poems written by two actually quite well-known poets, Shamastini and Thomas Kinsella, who very centrally also draw on the Irish language to write their poetry. And we will see why they do it in the first place, what the relevance there actually is. Now, this massacre takes place in the context of the Northern Irish conflict, sometimes called the Troubles, which I don't really like as a word because it sounds as if there was like a minor disruption rather than an armed conflict that lasted 3 decades. And as some of you will maybe know, the beginning of this conflict is actually rooted in the civil rights movement, quintessentially. So in Northern Ireland, Irish Catholics were systemically discriminated against. They didn't have the same access to housing, jobs, and voting rights as their unionist Protestant counterparts. And what happened was in the mid-1960s, there was an increase of demand to have this access. And as you can imagine, this wasn't necessarily met with a massive endorsement by the Northern Irish state, also by fractions of unionist politicians. And these civil rights protests were very often met with police brutality. Now, that's actually an image of a civil rights march that took place in Derry on Duke Street on, I think, the 6th of October, 1968. And that's usually dated as the day the Troubles began. There are two of those dates. But this is basically one of those moments where there was a massive police brutality against the marchers, and these images travel all around the world. Now, around this time as well, there are paramilitaries forming on each side, the IRA, the UVF, and then also later the UDA and the INLA. I'm not going to be talking a lot about these letters, but just so you know, and then of course the army is deployed in 1969. The army is originally deployed, I guess, to keep the peace and police the areas. That doesn't work at all. I guess, I'm not sure if it was surprising at the time, but they become very quickly enmeshed in the conflict, actually. And one thing that is also quite noteworthy is that around the time, there's also an establishment of no-go areas in Irish Catholic areas in particular. This is the no-go area of the bauxite, titled also Free Derry, where the army and the police can't really enter any longer because of these clashes, because these populations, of course, feel quite intimidated by them. What happens after that is that the Northern Irish state decides to introduce internment without trial. In August 1971, that basically means that overnight, hundreds of Irish Catholic men and boys are arrested and imprisoned indefinitely, so without being charged for anything or without seeing a judge even. And as you can imagine, this was met with a major outcry. And the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, which is the umbrella organization of the civil rights community in the North, decided they would organize anti-internment marches all over Northern Ireland, which were to start in December 1971. And one of these marches was set to take place in Derry. Now, Derry has a very special position in this conflict context, given that a lot of these clashes happen in Derry. It's, after Belfast, the second largest city in Northern Ireland, and it's predominantly Irish Catholic. And as you can see, it's right on the Irish border. So if these no-go areas exist and they're outside of police control, basically means there is like a border space that is outside of police and army control, which I assume caused a lot of unease. Now, for the march in Derry, which took place on the 3rd of January, 1972, it actually passed without major issues in the beginning. I suppose the only thing that was a bit of an issue was that the parachute regiment of the British Army was deployed to police the march, which they usually don't do. They are a unit that is on battlefields, and they're mostly in combat. So there was already a bit of unease around this, but in the beginning, nothing happened. They were also not really policing at that point. As you can see, like, this was a massive march. There were 40,000 people. That's one estimate. Another one is 20,000 people. I don't know, but I think it's roughly around that number from the photographs. Now, the actual incident happens at the end of this march, as the rally begins and the first speakers basically take stage and address the protesters. The parachute regiment becomes impatient to get in to do their arrests. They do go in, and immediately after going in, they shoot at the marchers, and they kill 13 people immediately on site within less than 15 minutes. And another 14th person dies 6 months later of his injuries. Another 14 people are critically injured at the time. So as you can imagine, this was very quickly a major issue. There was international press present who were confused about what was happening. And one of the generals, the army generals who was there, basically minutes after the massacre, he goes in front of a BBC camera and says that they only shot gunmen and bombers. and the eyewitnesses who are standing there are saying that they didn't see a gun on anyone, that people who were shot were already injured or lying on the ground or trying to run away. So there's this massive clash between the testimonies there, literally in minute one. As you can imagine, this brings the British government under a lot of pressure to explain why a march would end up in a massacre. And the British government then launches an inquiry to investigate what happened. This inquiry then basically backs the army's version, quintessentially. It singles out 6 of these teenagers and young men as gunmen and bombers. You have to imagine like their names are in the report all over media, their full addresses are everywhere, and they are singled out by name as gunmen and bombers without real indication. And this, of course, adds insult to injury. There is another massive outcry. And I guess for decades, the families and the survivors have been campaigning to clear their names. In 2010, the then Prime Minister David Cameron actually did apologize for Bloody Sunday. And there have been attempts to prosecute one of the soldiers as recently as September 2025. So this kind of the whole legacy of this massacre is still ongoing and still unfolding on the political arena in basically UK-Irish politics. But yeah, I guess it's safe to say that this is probably the reason why this is the single event in the context of the conflict that has been written about in literature. Maybe other than the hunger strike of 1981, but there the presentations or the portrayals are more in visual, I would say, visual, cultural productions. But Bloody Sunday very often, I guess, is like said to be the single event that makes it into literature. One thing that I guess is an interesting development at the time of the conflict is also that for such a small region, Northern Ireland then produces a lot of writers. So there are people like Seamus Heaney, Michael Longley, Derek Mahan, and Brian Friel, who are already established writers at the time the massacre happens. And there's just a younger generation coming up with Paul Muldoon and Maeve McGuckian, who are basically just starting out. And these writers are, of course, faced with the question, do I write about this conflict? Do I write about this massacre, or do I not write about this massacre? Now, of course, on the one hand, they have a platform, they could write about it, but writing at that time about the conflict, especially in a critical way, especially when it's identified as a colonial conflict, causes a lot of backlash. There are literary critics who, especially when it comes to Seamus Heaney, were kind of terming him as the poetic wing of the IRA. Basically just for writing. And so this question of whether to write or not to write is something that I also tried to explore in my research as well. Like, when did poets decide to write? When did they decide to publish? And what scrutiny they faced in that process. One poem that was actually written immediately after the massacre, days afterwards, was written by Seamus Heaney. It's titled The Road to Derry. And we know that he has written this on the days of the funerals of the Bloody Sunday dead that he also attended, because when you go to the archives in the National Library in Dublin, where his manuscripts are archived, you can see that the date is the 3rd of February. So this is basically coming out instantly after he goes to the funerals. One thing that is very interesting about this poem is that just as Seamus Heaney would have done himself, there is this speaker who travels to the funeral. So he's tracing the tracks of the poet as well. And it's also written in the tradition of a Gaelic lament to transport this immense feeling of grief. If we look at the first stanza of this poem, we already see that there is a lot of nature imagery being used. There are cold woods, there is a wet wind, there are hedges and a dark cloud. Of course, all of these things are used to evoke, I would say, sadness, maybe depression even, but certainly grief and mourning. And there's also black frost that transmits, I would say, maybe a feeling of paralysis. And it even goes as far as the rivers taking on a personified form. They are weeping, they're crying out to heaven. And this is, of course, no coincidence that Shamsini writes it that way. It's actually tied to the way Gaelic laments would usually transport emotions to begin with. Something I would say that is interesting about this also that it emulates imagery that we usually also find in keening, which is said to be an old and almost like died out tradition, where usually a woman loudly lamented over a death. So for a moment, she steps out of societal norm and openly, loudly mourns. And the imagery there is very, very similar. Usually nature is like also kind of taken in and not just like symbolically, but it's very much participating in this grief process. And Shamsini is actually emulating this to some extent. Another interesting aspect is also that in the second stanza, there are references made to other moments of violence. There is the mention of Burnt Tollett's Old Wound. That's a reference to an ambush of a march organized by People's Democracy. They were marching from Belfast to Derry, and then they were attacked by loyalists and then also by the police, actually. But something very interesting in terms of the Irish language happens in the final stanza. First of all, the speaker actually describes how his anxiety and his grief kind of make way for anger. He says that his heart is besieged by anger, his mind is a map of danger. That might be a bit surprising, but that's actually a reference to the fact that after Bloody Sunday, there was a mass influx for the provisional IRA. It's probably like the single event that led a massive amount of people to join. Even if you read like the interviews of provisionals, they will say either they joined because of Bloody Sunday or just after Bloody Sunday. So that line sort of grasps this moment. And then the speaker says that he walked among the old haunts and the home ground of those who have died. That is, again, very important, given that this is not just a massacre, this is a military invasion, quintessentially. I mean, the army even says to the cameras minutes after the massacre happens, we owned the bog side, we penetrated it, that's verbatim. And obviously using colonial language, obviously acknowledging that they are trying to invade a no-go area at that point. Now, what the speaker does here is, of course, to say, no, this is the ground of the dead. This is their hometown. This is the place where they bled, but where they have also lived. And then he moves on and compares justice lying in the dirt like an acorn in the winter, till its oak would sprout in Derry, where the 30 men lay dead. Now, the question, of course, here is why an acorn, why an oak? So for one, of course, if you, I mean, acorn and I guess what the oak is the fruit of the acorn. So if acorn is justice, then its fruit would be truth. So for one, it's directly pointing at Derry being the place where you can find justice and truth, if there is to be any. But at the same time, the speaker here actually points at the Irish etymology of Derry's place name. Derry actually in Irish means Dura Colum Killock, so the oak grove of Saint Columba. And I don't know if you look at the GAA jerseys of the Derry team, or if you even go to Derry and look at murals, you will see acorns and oaks everywhere. So on the one hand, this speaker is actually saying, revealing inside knowledge. He is saying he is from this area, he is part of this cultural memory and knowledge, and he's kind of knowledgeable about this. But at the same time, actually, he's also demarcating this contested space as linguistically Irish. So he's basically going for this military invasion and trying to undo this in his poem by saying, well, linguistically and therefore also culturally, this place is Irish, and that can't really be properly undone. And that's actually a strategy that we see Shamsini use quite often in his poetry. I mean, actually throughout his career, but especially in the anthology that he was writing as Bloody Sunday happened, and which was published like months, I think, after the massacre. To just give you one example, in his poem Anna Horridge, he writes of my place of clear water, where you can already see through the possessive pronoun, there is an ownership declared here. This is the place where Shamsini went to primary school. So he's very much sort of in hold of this place. And we see through the inverted commas that there is an alienation of the place of clear water. You're supposed to stumble over this. I have the brackets are basically added by me. That's not in the poem. But if you read that without the brackets even, you're supposed to understand that this is a translation. This is basically the translation of this anglicized place name into English. And if I'm not wrong, it's I think the Irish origin is Anacharishke, so it actually also means place of clear water. But this again is the same strategy that is being used here, this contested space of his childhood, that in the conflict context becomes this place where soldiers are basically going in and out, claiming streets, is also strategically demarcated as linguistically Irish to at least claim it in a cultural way, even if it's not possible to do that in a political way. And we see that actually in other poems. I'm not going to mention all of them, but also in Broch, where he is not just pointing at the etymology of this place name, but actually also the pronunciation. If you look at the poem, it says, the speaker says, there's this last GH that strangers found difficult to manage. And here there's this binary created between insiders and outsiders, those who can pronounce the place name correctly and those who can't. And I don't really think this is a sectarian binary. I mean, obviously locals in general will be able to pronounce it. I actually think it's a soldier or not soldier binary that is used in this context. Of course, also this pronunciation of the GH is something that is also from the Irish language. It is sort of pronounced that way because it is not an English name. And I mean, despite the fact that Shamsini went out of his way to demarcate so much in his poetry, with the Irish language, there is a little bit of controversy around this poem nonetheless. It was actually not just a Gaelic lament. It wasn't just written in this tradition. This poem was also supposed to be a song, sung to the air of the Boys of Mother Bawn. And so I suppose Shamsini had the intention to give it to Luke Kelly from the Dubliners, and for it to be performed as a song, actually, which would have amplified its I suppose, its distribution, but also its place as a lament. There were also other protest songs written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney at the time, U2 a little bit later, but it would have joined those ranks. But Shamsini didn't actually allow for anyone to record it as a song. Actually, he hid this poem for 25 years. It didn't see the surface, the daylight, for more than 2 decades. And he only published it in 1997. He published it in inverted commas by sending it to The Guardian and the Derry Journal. At the time, the families of the Bloody Sunday dead were campaigning for a second inquiry. And in order to back their demand, he basically decided to make this a public poem and published it in the newspapers, but again, didn't anthologize it. Also, Christy Moore volunteered to sing the song. He was shut down as well. Shamsini rejected that. And there was, of course, the question of why he did that. Why would you withhold this poem if you went out of your way and write it, and also write it so, with so much nuance as well. Nahini himself actually says that the poem is formally not to his liking, I suppose. He says that it doesn't quite work with the air, which I disagree with. I have tried it. It works with the air. I don't find it too ropey either. But he also said that he was a little bit concerned about the afterlife of this poem/song. So I suppose he was a bit afraid that it would maybe be, actually used as a propaganda tool, even in 1997. So he was very reluctant to allow for its a proper publication. My personal and academic opinion is actually that his withholding might have been impacted by what happened to another poet and his poem that was written about Bloody Sunday that I will be speaking about now. And that is Thomas Kinseller's Butcher's Dozen. Now, this poem was published. It was published immediately. It is a poem that is a direct response to the report of the first inquiry. So the first inquiry's report comes out, I think, on the 20th of April 1972, and this comes out 7 days later. Thomas Kinsler goes out of his way to establish his own publication house, even to print it and to be able to widely circulate it. And as you can see, I mean, I only have a black and white photo of it now because the pamphlets are also, they are archived. You can't buy them or borrow them, loan them. But they are also mimicking the publication form of this report. So Thomas Kinsler's approach is basically to say, I'm going to rebut this report by emulating it, by emulating its style as well. The question might come up why this might be controversial, and that's a fair question. What happens in this poem is that basically Thomas Kinsler is evoking, so the Bloody Sunday dead come back to speak to the speaker, to also speak against the tribunal. So we see the 13 men and boys come back in their injured states, and they very directly attack the inquiry and the British government and the Unionist state. And that earned Kinsler what we would today call a shitstorm. It was a massive outcry, not just literary critics, but also political commentators. Even I think the British and Irish Communist Organization was so appalled that they wrote an article about it, which you can imagine I had a lot to do in the archives because there was just so much on this. And I mean, just to give you an idea of how the criticism was, it was called politically biased, aesthetically flawed. It was accused of sentimentalizing those stone-throwing youths. I'm not quite sure how this conclusion was drawn. It was termed a dubious a dubious arousal of the heroic passions of the past. And it was also called fascist hysteria. And I suppose the understanding of fascism was quite loose in that context. But as you can imagine, it was kind of something that earned him a notoriety. This was actually a breaking point for his career. After that, he kind of had a bit of a stigma, and he didn't get rid of it for a while. An interesting aspect about this is though that Thomas Kinsler just simply republished this poem over and over again for anniversaries, even posthumously for the 50th anniversary. So he was not backing down. And I think over time, after the conflict came to an end, the literary criticism was also a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more putting it into perspective. Now, unfortunately, one thing that a lot of the literary critics at the time missed was a massive intertextual connection that would have probably helped understanding this poem to begin with. And maybe it wouldn't have been as strong a reaction if people had actually looked at the text in itself. Thomas Kinsler himself then came out and said that he wrote this poem as an Ashland poem and that he was inspired by Brian Merriman's Cured an van Ische, so the Midnight Court. And just to give you maybe a little bit of a context to what an Ashland poem is, it is interventionist and occasional in its own convention. These poems were traditionally written in the Irish language, but they have been readapted even in the 21st century. So there are English adaptations like Thomas Kinsler's poem, quite prevalent. And what happened usually in this poem or in this poetry was that a speaker would take a walk in nature, feel very melancholic, fall asleep, and then wake up to the vision of a spervan, so a sky woman, who was beautiful, radiant, but crying and lamenting her fate as being unfree and in chains, and kind of complaining that nobody was fighting on her behalf. Now, this Bervan is taken as a personification of Ireland, Ireland as a woman who is kind of lamenting her fate of being colonized and waiting for a just ruler to liberate her, quintessentially. Now, even Brian Merriman's Midnight Court, which would have been published in the early 19th century, was a satirical ashland. It was an adaptation of an ashland. I don't know if it's very, I think you can see the book. So I've put, this is the translation that Thomas Kinsella later did in a collection called Andemira, I think. So I took his own translation of the poem. And you can already see that to some extent it mimics the ashland. However, if you look at it, the ashland, he describes the Spervan in this context as 6 or 7 yards long, as being full bombed, as huge, grim, her face is half eaten, and she's terrifying. So he doesn't wake up to Ireland as this beautiful, radiant woman lamenting, but to what he calls incarnate horror, quintessentially. And now the question might come up, why is this happening? Why is this sky woman so strange? For one, I think this is still a comment on the present state of Ireland. Of course, Ireland has been colonized for a while now. She's not going to be as pretty. She is not going to be as beautiful anymore. In the 19th century, later on as well, this personification becomes the Shan van Vocht, like the poor old woman. And I guess this is a bit of a teaser to that. But also, like, Brian Merriman's writing that a little bit as tongue-in-cheek. This is a provocation of the reader as well. And what happens here is that this woman is actually the head of an all-female inquiry. It's a tribunal against the men of Ireland. The women are putting them on trial, and they're complaining that the men are not getting married in a timely manner, that they're not treating the women as well as they should. And you have these exchanges between women and men it's a very long poem, but it's a whole book. So I'm not going to show you all of that, but there is kind of like this back and forth between the men and the women of how they have wronged each other. And this sky woman is then the head of the inquiry who has to decide who's right or wrong. Spoiler, the women are right, of course. Now, Kinsella is actually, and that's something that I find quite interesting, is actually almost literally taking imagery from this poem to write his reaction to Bloody Sunday. So although our speaker here does not go into nature and fall asleep, he goes actually into an urban area, goes to the Bogside. It's a month since the shooting, but it's still defined by murder and by, it's still very much impacted by the aftermath of that shooting. But what happens here is that as this speaker is standing there and quite desperate at the sight of what has happened, there is an answering sigh. And he sees a ghost in a ghostly pool of blood, a crumpled phantom hogging the mud and saying, "Once there lived a hooligan, a pig came up and away he ran. And another one, here lies one in blood and bones who lost his life for throwing stones." And this goes on. There are more voices rise. The speaker turns and sees 3 corpses forming, red and raw. There are more mangled corpses, bleeding, lame, holding their wounds. They choose their ground, ghost by ghost, without a sound. Now, our speaker here is also faced with incarnate horror, actually. He wakes up to this horrific image of phantoms, of murdered men, basically addressing him, and very explicitly also addressing aspects that were covered in the report. So when one of them says, "Once there lived a hooligan, a pig came up and away he ran," that is actually quite identifiable as one of the victims who died on Bloody Sunday. That's the first person who was shot. And in the other lines where the 3 ghosts say, "Blight is 3, we scrambled back and made to flee, the guns quite stopped and here lie we," also in reference to 2 of the men who were shot at the barricade and who were explicitly named as gunmen. So that's, of course, a very interesting borrowing of imagery. Here, we don't have a sky woman, but we have the incarnate horror basically still implemented on the on the bodies of the Bloody Sunday dead. And of course, the question might come up, why are they in this state? They are in this state because they have to come back. They have to speak on their own behalf because no one else will. This inquiry has failed them. So they're holding their own spectral inquiry to rebut the British inquiry. And another aspect that is interesting as well is that this poem is entirely, there is no woman, there is no sky woman. The personification of Ireland does not happen via a woman. In an unusual manner, it happens actually via 30 men, which I don't think I've encountered before in any other piece of Irish literature so far. But of course, it is defined at that moment by the massacre. So this is very necessary that it has to be these specific men. And the reason for why both of these poets insist on having tribunals, of course, it's also quite a specific choice. The Sky Woman in Brian Merriman's poem describes her own tribunal, saying ni cuirt gan ach gan rach gan real, na cuirt na grach mar my apologies for my terrible pronunciation. But basically this the Sky Woman is basically saying this court is not baseless, it's not devoid of law, it's rooted in law. And that is actually an indirect reaction to the penal laws that would have defined Brian Merriman's own context. So he has to actually relocate justice and law with poetry, because in his own context, there's basically no other option for him at that time. And very similarly also for Thomas Kinsella, that happens to, he's a bit more straightforward. He is going straight for the inquiry. One of the ghosts is condemning them, saying the shame is theirs in word and deed, who prate of justice, practice greed, and act in ignorant fury, then officers and gentlemen sent to their courts for the Most High to tell us that we really die. And you can already see here, there is no funny sarcasm, it's very sardonic and very bitter. And what is, I suppose, and goes on here in a very similar manner, what is interesting is that the resolution in both of these poems are also quite different. In Brian Merriman's poem, the men of Ireland, I already told you, are found guilty. They're sentenced to be married at the latest by the age of 21, very young if you ask me, or face corporal punishment. And the speaker, who's also called Brian, is captured by the Sky Woman, by a collective of women. I'm not going to read out what happens to him then. It's supposed to be funny in this context. It's probably assault in our context. But of course, for that time being, it's kind of like a tongue-in-cheek. And even though this is like acknowledged as corporal punishment, this is still sort of like a juster outcome than what in Brian Merriman's context would have been considered as law. For Kinsella, the situation is a bit different. Kinsella is a little less hopeful. He actually, basically his argument is that as long as there is a unionist state at place, things like Bloody Sunday can always happen and will always be justified. So in his poem, the end is basically, it ends with a gentle rainfall drifting down over Columkiller's town, and it can't really refresh, it can only distill that rain. And what we see here is that we have a speaker at the end of this vision who is utterly transformed. He's standing there like a ghost now. He has taken on the form of basically of the dead that he's just witnessed. And if you see here, Kinsella does a very similar thing to what Heaney has done. He uses again the Irish etymology of Derry's place name, just the latter part, the Columkiller part, to again demarcate that area as linguistically and therefore also culturally Irish. Now, the question might be, why are they doing this? Why are they insisting on drawing on the Irish language, but also drawing on Irish language poetry to write about what has just happened in 1972? And that's just one strategy, actually. I also in my book, I talk about different strategies. Other poets, I don't know, establish analogies to other international contexts, like to Native Americans. or write about Bloody Sunday as an apocalypse in relation to English dystopian literature. But these two specifically make a point of sort of drawing on Irish language traditions. Now, I would say the reason for that is probably because they're in a quite tricky position, actually. They know they have to respond to this massacre in one way or another, but they're also writing in English already. They are poets who write and publish in English, even though both of them are fluent in Irish at that point. But writing in English might mean reaching a wider audience, but it also means you're writing in the language of the oppressor. You're writing also in the language in which the dead have been insulted, right? In the language of the report. So I would say not acknowledging the Irish language in these responses probably would mean a normalization of another form of colonial violence, which is, of course, the erosion of the Irish language. So what they do is they, on the one hand, point at the presence of the Irish language in the region for centuries and the remnants that are still there. And then they reclaim the contested space through this demarcation. And at the same time, they also basically take something that already exists in the Irish language, namely occasional interventionist and anti-colonial poetry, in order to basically shape an Irish response to what has been a British massacre. I think I will end here so that there's still time for questions. Thank you for your attention.